In this video, we're going to teach you literally everything you need to know about Vision that will actually help you win more games. Whether that's knowing the most efficient ward spots on Summoner's Rift, learning how to exploit the way Riot paths your champion from A to B, or understanding when you should actually swap your trinkets, we're going to show you how to use Vision to your advantage throughout every stage of the game, in every scenario, for every role. So let's get started. Highways and intersections. Despite being a hyper-complex game with nearly endless possibilities, the places people spend a lot of time on Summoner's Rift are relatively predictable, which also makes the paths between them really easy to work out. These highways, as we call them, connect areas of interest and the places you want to control, so you and the enemy walk along them all the time throughout the game, which is what makes them such great ward spots. But that isn't all there is to making a ward worth placing. Most people think Vision tells you the enemy's location, and a lot of the time that's true, but the best wards also tell you what they're pathing toward, and this distinction between location and movement is essential to placing efficient wards. A really common misunderstanding players have is that because deeper wards are difficult to place, they must also be more valuable, but that's not actually true. The real risk in placing deep vision isn't that you'll get caught, but that you'll put a ward in the wrong place and your opponents will walk into the area you're trying to control without being seen. Literally, by definition, deep wards don't give you much information about where the enemy's going, because it's further away from you and there are just more possible pathways they could use. On the flip side, you have intersection wards. Intersections are just zones on the map where multiple highways cross, which give you more opportunities to spot where the enemies are, as well as what they're pathing toward. For example, placing a ward in the brush behind red buff only really covers the highway roaming supports often take on their way to mid lane. But moving it to this intersection covers the highway that leads into the river or mid lane from raptors, the same roaming road, and even the path junglers take on their clears. Put simply, deep wards tell you where your opponents are, whereas intersection wards tell you how they're moving around the map. Lines of vision. None of that really explains where to ward exactly. The whole point of knowing where the enemy is, and more importantly, where they're moving to, is to help you make the best choices, to be able to make plays risk-free and to escape without worry. For example, as much as you ward the river to know when the jungler's ganking you, you also want to know how they're ganking so you can escape in the easiest way possible. And this is what makes intersection wards so valuable. Generally, you want to create vision around intersections at entrances to the area you want to control. Not only does this mean that they're easier to defend, but they also provide you with the crucial information you need to position correctly in team fights and skirmishes. The best example of this is when you set up for a neutral objective like Dragon or Baron. The area you want to control is the pit and the river around it, so placing wards in these three areas gives you coverage of nearly every entrance the enemy could realistically use. If you or your teammates have wards to spare, then placing some deep wards here and here gives you information about where they might be coming from and how far away they are. You can also just reorient this, by the way, when it comes to warding from red side or warding as both teams on Baron. However, neutral objective warding is the only rinse and repeat vision pattern you can actually use. As towers are taken and the game opens up, which intersections you should cover and where you should ward changes. Lines of vision, as they're called, map out the intersections you want to ward across Summoner's Rift, and they line up with whatever towers you and the enemy team have left standing. As soon as a tower falls, the way a champion will walk between lanes shifts, moving the most traveled highways. The reason this happens is a bit complicated, and I also think a bit unnecessary to explain or understand. But if you do want to know it in detail, we've put the explanation in the description below. In between each team's line of vision is no man's land. It's not controlled by anyone, and it holds no advantage for either team. And as you might have guessed, when towers start falling, no man's land gets larger. This is what makes vision so valuable. Placing wards in parts of no man's land gives you back that advantage, because it lets you see who's moving into it whilst they remain clueless. And doing this is even easier. Once you've pushed a lane that's missing turrets, your opponents need to clear the minions, giving you time to ward. Or they challenge that vision and lose minions in the process, making it a win for you either way. And just like before, it is literally as simple as placing wards in the entrances to parts of no man's land you want to control, covering intersections if you can. To summarize, once you've figured out what objective you want to claim, simply ward the immediate entrances to that area, keep them close so they're defensible, and try to find intersections that cover multiple ways in. Once towers start falling, you'll need to move that vision so it catches people moving along the new paths between lanes, and you'll need to reconquer no man's land by doing the exact same thing as before, placing wards in the entrances to the parts of it you want to control. Warding in the early game. Everything about warding comes down to time restrictions. In the early game, you essentially have only one ward to play with because they regenerate so slowly and expire so fast. But as a laner, the time restrictions are even more pressing. Laners can only go so far before they start missing minions, and those locations are usually pretty damn close to lane. In the early game for top and bot lane, the dot brush is the single most important location to ward because it covers the entrance that the enemy jungler will usually take to gank. ADCs might scoff at the idea of warding since that's why they have a support, right? But we'll explain in a second asking why that's actually incredibly harmful for your team generally, and in an ideal world, why supports shouldn't really have to ward the dot brush at all. For mid laners, you're going to want to ward the intersection near the enemy raptors. Chickens are the most contested camp in the game since they're the closest to both mid and the river, and they're the fastest jungle monsters to clear. So not only does warding here give you a great view of the enemy's movements, but it also gives you and your jungler information that could allow your team to invade for free. As a support or jungler, warding is a much more reactive process. Because you either don't CS or have to wait for your camps to respawn, you end up having considerably more downtime than the rest of your team, which means you are the only roles that can ward in the deeper spots your allies can't get to. As a support, before you've completed your item quest, you'll just want to replace the expired wards your laners had already put down. Then once you've completed the quest and have more wards to play with, you can start to ward the entrances your laners haven't covered when they've placed down their wards. For mid in particular, where you have entrances to the lane from two sides, placing vision on the side your mid laner literally cannot ward makes it one of the most valuable trinket placements in the game, and providing vision to your other laners' blind spots also allows them to play more aggressively in general. All that being said, probably the most common mistake low elo supports and junglers make is warding spots their laners can place vision in. Yes, laners are notoriously bad at refusing to ward, holding both trinkets for half the game and ending it with a vision score of 7, but one thing you can do to help them get better at that is not ward over the only spots they can realistically get to. The defining part of your role when it comes to vision is that you have more time to place wards than they do, so warding close to them restricts their vision placing even more and essentially starves your team of the deeper vision you could have placed instead. Speaking of which, there are only really 4 deep wards you will ever need to place in the laning phase. In a certain sense, early game deep vision actually gives you both location and movement information because of how predictable jungle clears are pre-6. Since camps only give more experience once they've respawned, junglers are kind of forced to full clear or they literally put themselves behind. So placing deep wards in between Gromp and blue buff as either the support or jungler gives you information about when the enemy jungler restarts their clear. This is insanely important. It allows you or your jungler to compare that to their own clear speeds to see how much more time they'll have to gank, invade, or take objectives, with the added benefit being that they also spot out potential ganks for either top or bot side. But this only really works in between these two specific camps. Trying to do this anywhere near either team's red buff is just impractical. You have to go extremely deep and won't ever be able to cover 2 camps with 1 ward. So supports and junglers should look to place a deep ward in the Raptor's brush instead. Junglers after they've finished their clears, and supports after they've recalled with an eye to roam mid lane. Like it or not, a laner's entire identity is built around getting CS, which means their warding spots are close to their lane, an important factor to understand for every role. If you're playing as a laner, prioritize warding the entrances that the enemy is most likely to gank through, and as a support or jungler, look toward the entrances they aren't able to cover and use the extra downtime you have to place deep vision that helps your team track the enemy jungler. Mid to late game warding. Whereas in the laning phase, the entrances you need to cover are nearly the same every game, once you open up into the mid and late game, you have to become more adaptable. It seems silly to describe it like this, but during the laning phase, the objective you're going for is the enemy tower, and the area you want to control is your lane, and that's why you ward the entrances to it. In the mid and late game, the area you want to control changes constantly in response to the movements of the enemy team and the state of the game, but the same rules still apply. Once you've got an idea of what you're playing for, whether that be a tower in the side lane, a neutral objective, or anything else really, you also know what area is the most important to ward. Using the 4 corners of the jungle, we can split the map into 4 easy quadrants, and depending on what objective you and your team are aiming at, you just need to prioritize the quadrant that's between you and the enemy team. For example, if you wanted to take Baron, you'd put it past Baron. If you wanted to contest it, you'd need to reclaim your own quadrant first. If you were split pushing, you'd want to control the quadrant the enemy's most likely to gank through. It is literally that simple. But even though laners can now have multiple wards on the map at once, they should still just keep to 1 trinket at a time. Because towers have fallen and the area they're going to be in is more risky, that ward is even more important. So laners should always have a trinket in the bank as a safety net in case their vision gets cleared. It's also pretty important to mention that once you get out of lane, you should be warding as a team rather than for yourself. For supports and junglers, everything post-laning phase is about enabling your winning side lane. Usually that means warding the pathways in between mid lane and the side lane your ally is in, getting even more vision in that quadrant so your teammate can see the movement of the enemy better and therefore avoid it. The obvious downside to this being, well, what if I don't have a winning side lane? If no one on your team is currently strong enough to have some control over a lane, your best bet is to try and create one using the same rules. You want to create vision in the quadrant between your teammate and the enemy team so you or they can make more aggressive plays safely. So really quickly, in the mid and late game, you still want to cover the intersection and entrances, but because the map starts opening up, you want to reposition your wards to cover the quadrants between where you want to be and where the enemies are going to get you from. With the supports and junglers jobs literally being the same as before, filling the gaps and entrances, but this time just on a wider playing field. Control wards. Control wards are one of the most misunderstood parts of vision. People mostly end up placing them primarily as a permanent source of vision. Obviously, that is what they do, but the real power they have is in denying vision. Because they allow you and your team to stand in a brush, knowing the enemy has no vision, you can very easily ambush them, which makes moving into that area inherently risky. But even more importantly, because it doesn't expire and has 4 hit points, it's incredibly difficult for them to clear and regain vision. But really, the first thing to mention is that pink wards are expensive. Considering it costs you 75 gold to buy and the enemy gets 25 gold for taking it, a poorly placed pink ward is kind of the equivalent to 1/3 of a kill. So because they're expensive, pink wards should only really be purchased when you plan on making a play of any kind, like an objective, tower, or even a gank, because you want to place them in areas you know you can consistently defend. The best locations for them are in, you guessed it, the entrances to where you want to be. 1, because they're such a valuable source of information for your team, and 2, because they're super close to where you are, making them easier to defend. And to clarify, for the record, laners should not be buying control wards. As we've said before, the whole reason you're in that role is to collect resources and buy items, so don't put yourself behind by buying a pink ward. The only exception to this is if buying a control ward helps you get a super important objective like Baron or Drake, in which case the payoff is definitely worth the price tag. But in nearly every other situation, they're just not something you should be buying. To summarize, don't place control wards in areas you can't defend. It is almost literally as bad as intentionally feeding. You should be using pink wards to control the entrances and intersections you think will have the most traffic, but only when you're making a play for an important objective or outcome. And finally, their most valuable ability is being able to keep an area free of wards because of how dangerous an unwardable brush is to your opponents. As one last little secret trick, there's also a really simple way you can keep track of an enemy's pink wards in lane without needing to see them place it. If your opponent comes back to lane with a control ward in their inventory, they're basically doing half the work for you, because if they disappear from lane and come back without it, it's generally pretty obvious where they've put it down. Which is why, if you're coming back to lane with a pink ward, always place it down before you go back into vision. It's much harder to track how many pink wards are on the map if you don't know how many the enemy teams bought. When to swap trinkets. Swapping trinkets is also super misunderstood. Red and blue trinkets are essentially specialized versions of stealth wards. They open up opportunities you can abuse to get advantages, which is what makes them powerful. But they're only worth swapping to if you can actually take advantage of them. For example, red trinkets are obviously used to remove wards, but they're also used to help you know when you're not walking over vision, which makes them extremely valuable to both flanking top laners and assassins, but not particularly helpful to split pushing tower takers. On the flip side, blue trinkets allow you to get vision in an area you're not comfortable entering, so for squishy carries they're insanely valuable and should be picked up as soon as possible, but on big beefy tanks it makes considerably less sense. Put simply, red trinkets are aggressive and blue trinkets are defensive, and that rule applies more generally to the game overall. If you've been pushing into your opponents over the last few minutes, then you're usually in control of that area already, and the enemy team needs to move into it to challenge you. As a result, having a bunch of sweepers gives you an insane amount of threat. For the same reasons we mentioned with control wards, denying an enemy's vision makes moving into it that much more risky for them, giving you more agency in taking the objectives you want. On the flip side, in an extreme situation like that, if the enemy does have a bunch of sweepers, blue trinkets actually reduce their impact, because you don't need to walk into the area to ward, and they kind of remove their usefulness since blue trinkets aren't even invisible. Obviously, that's like a super high level, coordinated example that's probably not very realistic, but it helps to outline why you would swap from a stealth ward to begin with, as well as highlighting how there isn't a specific time to swap either. For instance, assassins might swap to a red trinket to enable them to flank more successfully, but it's only worth swapping to that once they have enough items to kill a squishy target. Equally, you might start off using a red trinket to be more aggressive as a team, but have to switch back to a stealth ward or even a blue trinket if or when the enemy takes the lead back off you. There is no rule or exact time to swap your trinket. There are just conditions that make it worth swapping to. The most obvious example being that supports should swap to a sweeper on on the condition they've completed their quest item. And that's pretty much the same for every other role and use case. Think about what either trinket lets you do and what other things you actually need before it's worth swapping to them. Outside of that, aggressively using red trinkets or defensively utilizing blue trinkets comes down to the state of the game and again, how useful either of them actually are to you. Exploiting League's auto-pathing system. Piloting your character with mouse movements means Riot's had to design a system for pathing them from A to B in the most efficient way possible, which is a system you can very easily exploit. You probably already do this unconsciously, but if we, for example, take a look at how our champions path through the Raptors intersection to different locations, you'll notice how easy it is to guess where we're going. If I path through it toward Dragon, Riot makes my character hug the Dragon pit wall. If I path to the enemy blue buff, I move straight through the middle, and if I path to mid lane, I end up hugging the mid lane wall. The more aware you become of how Riot paths your champion around the map, the easier it becomes to not only make solid guesses at your enemy's precise movements, but also know how you can exploit them. For example, the banana brushes are the least traveled spots on the map because auto-pathing basically never ever takes you through them, which makes them incredibly good spots for a sneaky pink ward. Another way to exploit auto-pathing is in how you place your wards in intersections. This is bordering on unnecessarily obsessive, but hey ho, that's pretty much what we get paid to do on this channel. A red trinket sweep hitbox is smaller than the amount of vision stealth wards give, which when combined with an understanding of auto-pathing allows you to put down intersection wards in places that still get vision of the area but aren't revealed by common sweeping paths. For example, if you place your Raptors intersection ward here, it isn't seen by champs sweeping from mid lane to their jungle. Only when pathing from the top side of the river or when walking across it will it get revealed. Again, this is pretty much over-optimization, but the point here is to try and place wards in areas that aren't seen by sweepers on commonly walked paths. If I place that ward right in the middle of the intersection, it gets seen from any of the ways you can walk through it. So by being more consciously aware of how champions path and sweep, I can essentially make my wards even more effective because I'm hedging my bets that they won't always be revealed. Alright, so to do one last big summary, the two different types of ward you should be placing are deep wards and intersection wards. Deep wards only really tell you where the enemy is, whereas intersection wards also tell you where they're going, making them considerably more valuable. When thinking about where to ward, remember entrances and intersections. For the locations you want to control, ward the high traffic intersections that cover the most entrances to that area. For Baron and Drake, that's always very obvious and doesn't really change, but when you're not contesting a neutral objective, which intersection you should ward depends on your team's line of vision, which changes based on the towers that have fallen because the towers change the pathways champions take to move between lanes. Warding as a laner comes down to the time you can afford to be away from minions. Early game, top laners and ADCs should cover their dot brushes and mid laners should focus on getting vision of the enemy Raptors. Supports and junglers then fill in the gaps in this vision, again focusing on covering entrances and intersections to their allies' lanes. Deep vision here is all about tracking the enemy jungler because it helps your jungler understand their options and how they can take advantage of them properly. And after that, it's the same old story. At the risk of being too repetitive, throughout the mid and late game, you still want to ward the entrances and intersections, except this time it's not in your lane, it's in the area of the jungle that's between you and your opponents. Pink wards are overhyped. Laners shouldn't buy them, and supports or junglers should only really get one when they want to make some kind of play. Either way, you should always place them in entrances near the objective you're trying to get, so they're easy to defend and impossible to clear. Try to think about your trinket options tactically. What can they allow you to do better? When in doubt, red trinkets are aggressive and blue trinkets are defensive. And finally, remember that you can exploit the way Riot calculates pathing to your advantage, either when it comes to having a better idea of where they're going, or when it comes to where exactly you should place your vision. And that is pretty much it. I usually end these videos with a customary thanks for watching, because that's just kind of what everyone does, and I assume it's also what you probably expect. But this time, I do genuinely mean it. Thank you for making it this far, through what's been, I imagine, quite an intense watch. Your attention is genuinely appreciated, and to that point, if this has left you with any kind of questions, please leave it in the comments and we will respond to it. You've worked hard to get here, the least we can do is return the favor. But until next time, as always, good luck and have fun.